Labor's jelly-backed approach to global security issues is also demonstrated by the prospective ceasefire deal in the Middle East. The world is awaiting news of a deal between Israel and Hamas that's likely to see the return of the remaining living hostages and agreement for an international peacekeeping force to replace Israeli troops in Gaza. Now, I've got some concerns about what we might see. For instance, as has been the case since day one, all hostages, living and dead, with no exceptions, must be returned. It's an abomination that a single hostage was taken, and Hamas must be forced to hand everyone back. And secondly, I fear that too many Hamas operatives will be left alive and free in Gaza. These are the most evil terrorists imaginable. They've been committing war crimes daily, and every Hamas operative or sympathiser who remains alive and free in Gaza will undermine peace in the future and perpetuate evil. Still, with those caveats, of course, news of imminent peace is wonderful. Israel has been fighting for its very existence. Well, it's been doing that for more than 75 years, of course, but especially in the current war since October the 7th, 2023, 15 months ago. It's now seen off countless attacks from Hamas, from Hezbollah, the Houthis, and directly from Iran, which has also supplied and controlled those terror groups. But here's the thing about the Albanese Labor government. Right from the start, they've effectively been calling for Israel to just turn the other cheek, to accept the slaughter of its people and leave Hamas and Hezbollah in place. On the very day of the October the 7th atrocity, Foreign Minister Penny Wong was calling for Israel to show restraint. The Israelis were still finding their 1,200 dead, tending to their wounded and looking for hundreds of hostages, and Australian Labor was calling for them to show restraint in retaliating against the Hamas murderers. That set the tone, and Labor has been pathetic here at home, where Islamist extremists publicly celebrated the slaughter of innocent men, women and children, and the taking of innocent people as hostages, even mothers and babies. Well, Labor did nothing to stop those celebrations on our shores or the threatening chants against Jews at the Opera House. But when it came to our diplomacy, Labor kept turning its back and abandoning Israel at the United Nations. So much so that it won praise from the Islamist terrorists. Let that sink in. Labor's been so weak on Israel that they've won praise from Hamas. Labor's pressure on Israel and appeasement of the terrorists began within hours of the atrocities, and in those first few weeks, all Labor talked about was a ceasefire that would have left Hamas in place.
We want humanitarian pauses as a necessary first step. We've said that any step on a path to ceasefire can't be one-sided.
We want to see the next steps towards a sustainable ceasefire.
And as time went on, Albanese and Wong only got weaker, only got worse, throwing their lot in with other weak-kneed leaders around the world.
We showed the extent of our cooperation with the joint statement we made with Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, condemning Hamas's terror attacks on Israel, supporting urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire.
We want to see a sustainable ceasefire, and we see an international humanitarian, immediate humanitarian ceasefire as a step towards that.
Just consider what was going on here. Hamas was still holding hundreds of hostages, killing, torturing and raping them, still holding babies as hostages, and it was still killing Israeli soldiers and firing rockets into Israel, and Australia kept calling for a ceasefire that would have left Hamas in place, running Gaza and committed to eliminating Israel.
We are clear that a sustainable ceasefire is necessary to finding a path towards securing lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians.
If Israel had listened to Albanese and other weak leaders, the Hamas leadership would still be in place.
Iran's Revolutionary Guards said Haniyeh and one of his bodyguards were assassinated in the capital Tehran. In a statement, Hamas said he was killed in a treacherous Zionist raid on his residence in Tehran.
Yeah, while Israel was eliminating murderous monsters, protecting its people and doing the world a favour, Albanese kept up the same old refrain.
It is time for all parties to agree to that ceasefire and those arrangements. We want to see hostilities cease.
And again, if Jerusalem listened to Albanese and the Australian Labor government, it would have laid down its arms and this wouldn't have happened.
This is the last stand of Israel's most wanted man. On the first floor of a building in Rafah, an injured Yahya Sinwar is slumped in a chair, his face covered by a scarf. In a final attempt to survive, he throws a plank of wood at the Israeli military drone. It misses, and he was killed moments later.
Yeah, another crucial episode in Israel's defence. Then the threat to Israel from the north escalated as Hezbollah terrorists based in Lebanon increased their attacks. Still, Labor thought Israel should stop defending itself and stop eliminating terrorists that are committed to eradicating their country.
Sinwar's death is an opportunity for this war to end. We again call for ceasefire.
And again, if Israel had listened to these calls, it wouldn't have decimated the heavily armed threat posed by Hezbollah.
Across Beirut, Lebanon, and even parts of Syria, more pages exploded in a coordinated attack on Hezbollah. Hospitals were put on high alert, and there were calls for blood donations.
This was a brilliantly effective counterattack by Israel, years in the planning. But even with Israel under attack from so many foes intent on its elimination, Labor wanted the counterattacks by Israel to stop.
Our government has consistently and repeatedly called for a ceasefire.
Labor kept calling for ceasefires and voted for them at the UN, taking the pressure off Hamas and off Hezbollah and off the Houthis and off Iran. Israel ignored those calls and defended itself against monstrous enemies.
Israel said it killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah.
Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the terrorist army Hezbollah, was killed by Israel Defense Forces in a precise strike in Beirut last night.
It's been a tragic 15 months. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in Gaza. Most of them, we hope, were Hamas terrorists, although many in the media pretend they're all innocent civilians. More than 2,000 Israelis have been killed by the terror attacks and in military combat. All the deaths are on Hamas and Hezbollah and on Iran. And we expect an end to all this to be announced soon, just weeks after the president-elect first said this.
If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. Can you elaborate? And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out.
If this deal happens, Israel will have survived through strength. It will have taken out most of Hamas, decimated Hezbollah, put the Houthis back in their box and forced Iran to rethink its meddling in the region. The rockets will have stopped landing in Israeli towns and we hope the hostages will have been returned. So it was pathetic to see our Prime Minister trying to associate himself with that outcome today.
We have been calling for some time for hostages to be released. We want Hamas to have no role in the future of that region, and we want a ceasefire in the interests of both Israelis and those in the occupied Palestinian territories. So we are hopeful of a ceasefire. That would be a good thing. I think that is what overwhelmingly Australians want to see, and indeed the international community wants to see as well.
Really? He's been wet lettuce. Australia has been wet lettuce. None of the key outcomes would have happened if Israel had listened to the likes of Albanese and Labor and their friends in the international community. If they'd been listened to, Hamas and Hezbollah would now be stronger than ever and ready to attack again.